Pasuk Gimel. Vayivar Boim Shono. It was in the 40th year. Ba'ashtei Osur Chodesh Bechad LaChodesh. It was in the Ashtei Osur, 11th month, first of the month. Diber Moshe El Bnei Yisrael Kol Asher Tziva Hashem Osur Lemor. All that God had commanded him to say. I mean, this is the review of the Torah. Achrei Hakoso Esichon Melech HaMori Asher Yoshev B'Cheshbon. After he had smitten Sichon, the king of Mori, who was his territory was Cheshbon. There's Og Melech HaBoshon and Og, who was the other giant. They were the protectors of Canaan. Asher Yoshev B'Asher Sedrei. That's when he began rebuking them. So Rashi over here cites something which is similar to what the Ramban had said, but this is the Midrash. Omer Moshe, Imani mochichem kodem sheikonsel l'ktsas oretz. If I begin rebuking them before they enter to any degree into the land, Yomru, what are they going to say? Madel zel leinu. What does he want from us? Ma hativ lono, eno elo lekantev lipso elo. He's only coming to criticize us and find fault in us. He doesn't have the ability to bring us into the land. So what's his value? His value is only to reprimand us and to point out our shortcomings. Therefore, he waited until he toppled Og and Sichon, which were literally an impossibility. Only Moshe could do this. And he allowed them to conquer that land, that territory. Because now, since they were beneficiaries of his leadership and they see his value to benefit them, so they understand that the criticism or the admonishment is something so they should not fail again. But there's hope, meaning if a person doesn't see the light at the end of the tunnel and all he hears is criticism, it's your fault, and you're always pointing the blame of finger at the person, if the person says, something, if that's the case, what's the value of leadership? You're taking us nowhere. But since over here, his leadership brought them to be able to conquer the Transjordan side, so therefore they see him that his leadership has that value. So now they understand that the admonishment is for their interest. It's not just to admonishment to point out that they're at fault. Many years ago, a certain person got involved, and I told the person certain things about that. Avos Hashem is not sufficient. You have to have Yiras Hashem, because without Yiras Hashem, the person has nothing to fear. I love God, so if you love Hashem and there's nothing at stake, and you don't appreciate the consequences of misbehavior, it's not going to carry you through all these situations. And this person took issue with me to the point that this person was upset and turned away. And then recently, I had the conversation with this person and her husband, and she says to me, and I hadn't spoken to her for maybe 10 years, and she's a woman reaching middle-aged, and she says, Rabbi, I want to tell you something. You were 100% right that love is not sufficient to carry you through to deal with all the issues. You have to have fear of Hashem. It's absolutely right. Without fear, love will not carry you through. You have to understand the consequences to your behavior. And if there's no fear, the whole issue of consequences has no relevance. Moshe Rabbeinu is rebuking them and explaining to them that if you cross lines, you're going to be punished. The question is, what do you have to show for us? So Moshe says, we have to show, look where we've come. The conquest has started. Therefore, now they have an appreciation. What is the value of his leadership? That they should be beneficiaries. And they're already seeing it. Therefore, now he's tweaking it. The admonishment is tweaking the system that you should not fall into the pitfalls of the past to be able to continue to succeed. That's the psychological appreciation And that's why, when did he begin rebuking them? Only after they conquered the territory of Sichon and Og, for that reason. Asher Yoshib B'cheshbon. What does Torah here have to identify where Sichon was located? His territory was Cheshbon. Ilu lo hoyo Sichon kosher. If Sichon wouldn't have been so difficult to conquer, he was a giant. Well, Yishori B'cheshbon. And that location was so fortified, hoya kosher, it would have been more difficult enough. Shamadino kosher. V'lohoisa ir acheres. And if it wouldn't have been Cheshbon, it would have been an open city. V'sichon shari b'socho, but Sichon, that was his location. Hoya kosher. Shamel kosher. It would have been very difficult because the king, Sichon being a giant, it would have been nearly impossible to conquer it. Allah's kam v'kamo shamelech kosher, b'medina kosher. So there's no question. The king is a person which is not, he's so formidable, you can't beat him at his game, and the Medina and the location is fortified. Therefore, as a result of that, and despite that, we succeeded. Hashem was with you, and he was vanquished. Ashiyoshe be'eshtu ashtoros, hamelech kosher Medina kosher. We'd mentioned when Sichon and Og were killed by Moshe, Klal did not say Shira. Did not say Shira. And the Midrash tells us that when such a miracle takes place, one has to acknowledge that level of miracle. And how's it acknowledged? By saying Shira. After the splitting of the sea, we said Shira. The story about the Amorites, when we went through the valley and they went through these boulders on us, and we weren't aware that the mountains came together and then separated. It's only we were aware of it because the air, the wellspring went up into the mountains and washed out the caves. And when they saw the remains of all these people, they understood what Hashem had provided, the miracle. They said, Ali Be'er. They sang the song of the wellspring. But over here, and because the Midrash says, and I mentioned this, that to be able to the conquest of Og and Sichon was more difficult than the conquest of Paro v'Chelo, Marco v'Chelo. It was more difficult to beat Og and Sichon than to destroy Egypt. What does this mean? The Gemara tells us in Nida, when we speak about these wars, it wasn't just the physical war. These people represented the nether forces, which were contrary and the adverse representation to what we were. Sichon and Og, in terms of their representation of evil, were a greater representation than Paro and Egypt. To be able to vanquish them was more difficult. It's not only the physical, it's their level of representation. We read last week about the destruction of Midian. There was only 1,000 per tribe who went to war. And Moshe Rabbeinu chose only the tzaddikim. Only the tzaddikim. I mean, other wars, whoever was of age, was eligible for conscription, went to war. But this particular war by Midian was only specifically 1,000 per tribe, but they had to be tzaddikim. And he goes over there to explain, and it says, B'chem Hashem b'Midian, Moshe Rabbeinu says. Because over here they had failed with the Baal Peor and with the women, the prosecution against them was so extreme that their level of representation of evil, the nether forces were so empowered, they had vanquished the nether forces during that war. And that's the reason why we find Bilam was in the war also. And Pinchas, who had that representation of Kedusha, because he had killed Zimri, he had to be part of that war to represent the good. So it was a battle of good and evil. It wasn't just a battle of what? A physical battle. Because it was physical, then numbers would make a difference. Numbers, it wasn't a numbers game over there. There it was, spiritually speaking, what is your quality of Kedusha? Therefore, they had to be tzaddikim, and the number was irrelevant there. To be able to vanquish Og and Sichon, these giants, it wasn't just because they were physical giants. They were inconquerable because of what they represented. And therefore it says they were kosher and the Medina was kosher. The Gemara tells us, we read in the Torah about the Ori Miklot, that if a person kills inadvertently, he has to flee to a city of refuge. Now, there were 6 cities of refuge. Now, where were they located, the 6 cities of refuge? 3 were located on the Transjordan side, and 3 were located in Eretz Yisrael. In terms of the mass of territory, where was the territory much greater, larger? Eretz Yisrael. Transjordan was only considered a small area compared to that. So the Gemara asks, so why did you need 3 Ori Miklot, 3 cities of refuge on the Transjordan side? The Gemara asks the question. Gemara says because Shchichi Rotzchim, because in the Transjordan side, there was an abundance of murderers. Therefore, people who were not that careful, they killed inadvertently, they had to flee to these cities of refuge. Therefore, you had to have a greater level of these cities there than compared to all Eretz Yisrael. But why was Shlichi Rotzkin? Why were there more murderers? Because the environment was more conducive to go in that direction. But why was it more conducive? I mean, the tribes were good people. The answer is because certain areas, it breeds it has a representation which it draws people in that direction. Because this was the location of Sichon and Og. That was a representation of evil, even though they were vanquished, but nevertheless, their territory still had traces of that representation. As a result of that, you needed 3 cities of refuge on the Transjordan side. So to be able to defeat them was an impossibility. It was only Moshe Rabbeinu, because of his level of representation of Kedusha, he was able to vanquish them. They did not say Shira. David HaMelech, years later, said Shira to compensate for what Moshe Rabbeinu did not do. Because such a level of accomplishment, such a level of achievement, it has to be acknowledged. It's nothing less than Kilo Lom Chazdo. So the 26 Kilom Chazdos that David had said was to fill in for Moshe Rabbeinu did not do. So when we speak over here, Melech Kosher, the king was kosher and the location was kosher, I'm not talking about in the physical sense. We talk about the representation of evil, what they represented. David is only coming to acknowledge the miracle of those wars. Why does he start from the beginning of creation? Right? He should just acknowledge what happened at that particular moment. What Moshe Rabbeinu didn't say, right? The Shira, which he didn't say, he said the Shira in terms of that level of achievement. But he starts from the very beginning. So what we explained was that what happens, there's an objective to arrive at a certain destination. So creation only has value only if ultimately Sichon and Og are going to be vanquished. If they're not going to be vanquished, you're going to come to a dead end. You can't go beyond that point. So at the end, all creation has value now because Hashem allowed Sichon and Og to be vanquished, because you couldn't have gone beyond that. That representation of evil had to be removed, because otherwise the objective of creation could have never come about. Therefore, we acknowledge Sichon el Chamori Kilam Chasdo, Og Mel Chaboshon Kilam Chasdo for that reason. That's why he had to start from the very beginning and conclude with that.
Rabbi, if Moshe was not allowed to go into Eretz Yisrael,
Torah says when we went into Eretz Yisrael, there were 3 mitzvahs we had to fulfill after the conquest. What are they? Appoint the king, which Saul was the first king appointed, to obliterate Amalek, and to build the Beis HaMikdash. Those were the 3 mitzvahs given to us when we went into Eretz Yisrael. The king, destroy Amalek, and then the Beis HaMikdash. Because Amalek, now we can talk about the Beis HaMikdash. Kil Hashem Amlucha Moshe Bagoyim. Because only after Amalek is vanquished, then we could talk about Hashem Echad Shmo Echad. So that was the sequential order. What happened? Unfortunately, Shaul failed. Shaul did not fulfill the mitzvah properly, and there were serious traces of Amalek left. He did not kill Agag, who was the king of Amalek. And because of that, he forfeited his kingdom for that reason. God says, I regret I installed him as the king, David is going to be the eternal king. That's David Melchel Chai V'Kayom. And who's going to bring about that ultimate level of vanquishment? That's Mashiach ben David. Mashiach ben David, he's going to be, the world is going to be totally expunged of that evil of Amalek. So we're going in that direction. I'll give you an example. We find that at every era, there's always a counterbalance for evil. There's a representation of good, and then there's a representation of evil. For instance, Avraham Avinu was the one who introduced monotheism to existence. And he's the first one who referred to Hashem as Adni. Aleph, Daled, Nun, Yud. Adni, he's the master. He introduced monotheism. Avraham Avinu was called the Ivri. What was Ivri? Hu me'ivri echad, kol me'ivri Hashem. He took on the world single-handedly. Avraham Avinu. And that's why he's the founding father of Klal Yisroel. Now, who was the counterforce to Avraham? Nimrod was the counterforce to Avraham. Nimrod had taken Avraham and threw him into the kiln because he was agreeable to forfeit his life for Hashem. Hashem performed the miracle, he came out alive to be able to be the founding father of Klal Yisroel. Now, when did Avram pass away and when did Nimrod die? You realize they died on the same day. The day Nimrod was killed, Avram passed away on that day. Because the story, Esav comes, who's the hunter, comes from the field, and it says he's fatigued and weary, and he sees Yaakov, his brother, is cooking lentil soup. And the Midrash says, and his forehead is smudged with soot. So he says to his brother, what happened? He says, our grandfather passed away. So the day, and this is, where is he coming from? He had just killed Nimrod, because Nimrod had the garments of Adam Rishon, which were provided by Hashem when he realized he was naked. And these were hunter's garments, because when you wore this garment, it attracted all the animals. And Asa, being a hunter, he wanted those garments. Nimrod wasn't willing to relinquish them. So what he killed him. He comes home, he finds out his grandfather passed away. The same day. It means the world cannot exist without a Nimrod if there's an Avram. Because Avram's ability is so overwhelming, one doesn't have choice. You have to have a counterforce to put the balance. Now, person has a choice. With Avram alone, there's no choice. You're going only in the positive direction. So therefore, as a result of that, the day that Nimrod is killed, Avram is killed. That Yaakov and Esav, the day that Yaakov was interred in Marsa Machpelah, that's the day Esav was killed. So story, he arrived at the burial and he contested the right, and Chushim ben Don, Chushim the son of Don, had actually decapitated Esav, and his head rolled into the Marsa Machpelah, into the cave. And Rivka had forecasted that she's going to lose both sons at the same day. Although Yaakov himself was no longer alive, but the interment, his level of representation, existence no longer is. So when he no longer existed, his neshama was no longer in this world. Esav was no longer in this world at any level. Now, who was the greatest prophet that ever lived among Jews? Moshe. But it says, Lokam Novi to Moshe be Yisroel. There was no great prophet than Moshe in Yisroel. But the Gemara says, about the Umas Olam, but the nations of the world, there was a prophet who was the equivalent of Moshe made. Who was that? That was Bilam. Bilam Arosha. When was Bilam killed? Bilam was killed towards the end of the 40th year of the Jews about going into Eretz Yisrael. That was the battle with Midian. Moshe Rabbeinu, soon afterwards, Hashem says, he has 36 days to live. And Moshe Rabbeinu was leaving this world. They cannot go into Eretz Yisrael if there's a Moshe, there has to be a counterbalance. There's no counterbalance. If there's no Bilam, you can't have a Moshe. So if Bilam is removed, Moshe is removed. There's always this back and forth. That's what it is. Only Moshe was able to counter the evil of Sichon and Og. No one else had that ability. But again, once they're removed, Moshe Rabbeinu's representation, Yeshua, was only a reflection, as it says, Pnei Moshe Pnei Chamo, Pnei Yeshua Pnei Levana. Moshe was the sun, and Yeshua was the equivalent of the moon, reflecting the light of the sun. He was not at the same level. But to be able to vanquish the nations of Canaan, Yeshua was sufficient. He was able to do it. You didn't need Moshe Rabbeinu. So therefore, after Sichon and Og were removed, Moshe Rabbeinu soon afterwards passes away. There's no Bilam. That level of representation of evil no longer exists. Sichon and Og no longer exist. Now we're ready for real time. The conquest, but Moshe is not there. Yeshua, who's only a reflection of Moshe, he's sufficient. We read every morning in the Psukim de Zimra, right? We say, you, Hashem, took Avram out of the Ur Kasdim, the kiln of Kasdim, v'samta shmo Avraham, and you establish his name to be Avraham. When he came out of the Ur Kasdim, he did not become Avraham right away. He became Avraham at the age of 99 when he was circumcised. But as a result, the Midrash tells us, because he was willing to give his life, therefore, v'samta shmo Avraham, he became Avraham. Avram is Behi Bahram. He's the equivalent of all existence. And you found his heart was faithful to you. What's the next paragraph we say? Because he became Avram, now it's Chorasim Abris, let's say it's Eretz HaKnani. Now, because of that, he entered in the covenant. He's giving us Eretz Yisroel, the land of the nations of Canaan. What do we have to say that? You know why? Because Avram, only because he was willing to achieve that level of achievement, he has that representative Kedusha. Now he could counter the 7 nations of Canaan, which is the ultimate, was also a certain representation of evil. Because he became Avram, now he has the empowerment to be able to deal with the 7 nations of Canaan for that reason. Therefore, a result of Avram, the Chorasim Abris. But Amalek, that's the end of time. That's Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David. That's when Amalek will be removed. That's when Hashem will be declared, because there's not going to be any level of interference, and it will be absolutely clear there's nothing other than Hashem. Until then, Hashem says, my throne is not complete. The Gemara asks, so if the coming Mashiach is predicated on tshuva, what happens if we don't do tshuva? How is it going to happen? So the Gemara says that even if Hashem has to install a king, that his decrees are more severe than Haman or Russia, he will do that to force us to do tshuva. If it's me'avo, if you do tshuva on your own accord, it's not necessary. The Chevdei Moshiach, all the birth pangs of Mashiach are going to be less painful, because by doing tshuva, what are we doing? We're vaporizing that representation of evil. But if we don't do tshuva mi'avo, and we're still steadfast in our positions of where we should not be, Hashem's going to put us in that vise and twist our arm to the point where we have no choice but to do tshuva. And then when we do tshuva, but what is the process? Tremendous pain. And that's why at the end of time, if we don't do tshuva mi'avo, the pain is going to be excruciating, because there's that evil there, and the evil has to take its pound of flesh. And after that, we're going to do tshuva, and when that happens, that evil will be totally vanquished and removed from existence. And that's the coming of Mashiach. So the Chofetz Chaim says, that's what the Chofetz Chaim said, that World War II, this is before World War II, maybe almost 20 years before, he says, World War I is child's play compared to what World War II is going to be. But what is the consolation? Knowing that it's going to be so severe, that's a confirmation. That's Chevdei Moshiach. That's part of that's the birth pangs of Mashiach. World War II. So I saw recently, based on the Zohar, and maybe I mentioned yesterday, the 3 Milchemes Gog v'Magog. World War I was the first. World War II is the second. And the third, Mechemes Gog Magog, that's the last one. It's based on the Zohar. Right now, we're approaching the third Mechemes Gog Magog. What's happening right now? Now this is global. This is something beyond even World War II. World War II was limited to Europe. The Northern Hemisphere didn't experience what Europe, but the anti-Semitism now that's being fomented here in the States and the direction of all the free world, so to say, is going against the Jewish people, against Israel. Our existence is in a position of being put in jeopardy. That is the foretelling that we're holding by the end. I'm just quoting the Chofetz Chaim, the Zohar, and what the Ramchal writes. So as painful as the script is, and as how dire it is, it's already, we're seeing that's the light at the end of the tunnel with Hashem's help. And the more we do good, the less the pain will be, and the quicker it's going to happen. Many years ago, today, we've become very sophisticated. People go to a mikveh